I tend to use the word overexcited or excited quite a bit or overuse it. But I am so excited about the next panel because it's about the future of protein, whether it's meat or insects or nuts. I'm just really excited about what the future holds in terms of providing protein for the planet. And I think we really have the perfect keynote for this panel today. Arlin Wasserman is the founder of Changing Taste and a fellow at the Center for Leadership and Global Sustainability at the Virginia Polytechnic University. He was formerly the vice president for sustainability at Sodexo and is a past recipient of the Kellogg Food and Society Fellowship. And we're really honored to have him here today and to share his thoughts about the future of protein with us. After Arlin's remarks, Sam Fromartz from the Food and Environment Reporting Network will be moderating the panel. We'll have time for questions. I hope you all will all continue using the hashtag #FoodTank, and we'll look forward to hearing your questions. Arlin, please, we welcome you to the stage. Please join us. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me here, and I'm glad to give a talk on protein, which I've been working on for a while, because we are certainly having a protein moment. It used to be that we were having a fat moment or a fat economy, or maybe even a blubber-based economy. And you know, the whales are still recovering from that choice. And a few of us may be old enough to remember when we thought we might be entering a carbohydrate economy. Maybe our farm policy and biofuels policy still indicates that, but on Food for People, well, that met Dr. Atkins and then the paleo movement. And we are in a protein economy. And for those of us who are in the business of trying to get people to eat some foods but not others, or some food products but not others, we know that simply saying now with more protein means now with higher sales. The nutrition community, excluding a few people who were on stage earlier today, probably along with the medical community have a lot to do with this, because we know that we should be afraid of fats. Now we should be afraid of carbs. And there's really not a fourth macronutrient that we can eat other than protein, although I would vote for coffee. The fixation on protein, our protein economy, this protein moment, is not something that those of us in the room really had anything to do with. I would point the finger at Herbert Hoover, presidential candidate. He was successful. And he gained office in part by helping us out of the protein crisis. He promised a chicken for every pot. That change in food policy in our country allowed us to both triple the population of the US while eating better, weighing more, and being more affluent, and also triggered a 9-fold increase in the US chicken population. No small feat. If only chickens could vote, he might still be in office. But it's a good thing that he did this, because previously we were in a time of protein insufficiency. And look around you and see if any of the people in this room are suffering from these symptoms, which include ridged fingernails, take a look, and random fainting. If you know a family member who is suffering from protein insufficiency, a friend or a colleague, please raise your hand. Okay, good to know. And that's because in the US, the typical adult gets between 90 and 113 grams of protein a day, depending on whether you believe we're underreporting how much we eat or overestimating how much we waste, although food waste is still an issue. And that's about twice what the average adult needs, and a little bit more than a professional athlete needs when they're trying to add muscle. It's not a US situation. In China, at least the official numbers are that a typical adult there gets over 90 grams of protein compared to the 45 to 57 that most people need. What is protein? It's the building blocks that give cells structure. If we didn't get enough protein, we wouldn't just have ridged fingernails and fainting. We'd look a lot like soup. And protein is made up of amino acids. We all remember hearing that in school. It's like an alphabet in a Scrabble game. You need to put them together to build the right words for muscle or brain cell or clotting factor. And if you run out of some letters in Scrabble, it's game over. You just throw away the rest. Just like when we eat a lot of protein and we don't use all the letters each day, we get rid of the rest. All foods have structure, even the foods that go into soup, and all foods have protein in them. Animals just have a better ratio of the foods we eat, the right letters to spell common words, because they're more like us, especially animals. And they get their amino acids like we can by eating plants. And the feed conversion ratio of how many plants you need to eat to stay healthy, or how many plants you need to put in the front end of a cow, pig, turkey, chicken, or farmed fish, really makes up the entire environmental difference in a lot of the foods we eat. That difference also sets a promising course, because we are in the US having a dramatic decline in the amount of red meat we eat. Pick your baseline year, and we're getting rid of red meat by about 20% over the last 5, 10, or 15 years. And if we rebalance that plate and fill up that empty space with something different and eat the recommended daily allowance of protein, not a whole lot more, we solve a lot of problems. Intensive livestock rearing and antibiotics. Feeding antibiotics to farmed fish and seafood. Reducing the need for the 2 most widely planted GMO crops. Opening enough cropland that is now going to animal feed so that we could grow enough fruits and veggies for all of us, and maybe another 300 to 600 million people, reduce our carbon and water footprint. And some of those benefits come from something as simple as switching out a serving or a snack. That playing-sized card of red meat switched out for a handful of almonds or nuts, or if you want to be a little more hipster, maybe chipotle-flavored baked fava beans, which seem to also be about to have their moment. That can yield huge differences. It also gets us, not to mention, a bit healthier. Harvard School of Public Health has let us know that switching out that one playing-sized piece of red meat a day, that one serving, would save us the risk of dying early from all causes, no matter what we switch it for, practically. Fruits and vegetables, grains, low-fat dairy, nuts, beans. The Predimed study, which is the largest study of the Mediterranean diet, showed that really those health benefits come largely from eating almonds and tree nuts, olives, and olive oils. So whether we want to eat that Mediterranean diet, the flexitarian diet, a low-carbon diet, a plant-forward diet, or the domain name that I recently registered, Caleo, climate change is putting our ability to grow those crops in Mediterranean growing regions, which include Greece, Spain, Italy, Turkey, Australia, South Africa, and also California, the only places in the world well suited to grow nuts and olives, at risk. So in closing, I'd say with respect to protein, we need to move to the diet we aspire to eat. But we also need to take steps to ensure that we are able to continue to grow the foods that make up that diet. And then for those of us who are leading in food, or cooking for ourselves, or serving others, make the right choices for what we put on the plate. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your moderator, Sam from Fromartz, Food and Environment Reporting Network.
So thank you, and it's great to be here. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Food and Environment Reporting Network, and we're, I'm happy to say, one of the media sponsors of this event. So we're a nonprofit investigative journalism organization, and we're also publisher of the Daily Ag Insider Food Policy Briefing. And we're going to launch into the meaty subject around proteins today. And it's titled Protein for the Planet, but I think it could have been called Protein Possibilities, because we're sort of looking beyond protein as we really think about it as meat. Because when you frame protein that way, you might think of a good steak or a really good hamburger, but you also see some really scary projections. Today at Ag Insider, we covered a report by the World Resources Institute, and I'm going to crib some figures from that. Globally, as incomes rise, the world is eating more meat, and consumption is projected to rise by 80% by 2050 if current trends continue. Now, most of that is happening in the global south as incomes rise. You might not know that animal-based foods take up 3/4 of the world's agricultural lands, and they account for 2/3 of agriculture's greenhouse gas emissions. And as we just heard, the average American can easily cut their protein intake in half and still exceed recommended levels. And that's not only true of the US, but many other developed and some developing countries of the world as well. And I'm just going to throw this out there because we often hear the phrase that we need to feed 9 billion by 2050. But if you're thinking about feeding the world on the current sort of model, on the status quo, it's hard to see how we get there without more industrialized meat production, without corn and soy, if things don't change. And I would ask, if that's really a sustainable model. I think if you look at this panel, you'll see that protein is more than just meat, or meat as we usually think about it. I'm not going to introduce everybody because you have the bios in your packet, and I'll let them introduce themselves briefly before they talk. But we've got someone here selling edible crickets. We've got someone who sells grass-fed beef, a vegan activist, a venture capitalist, democracy proponent. I think Bernie Sanders would kind of like that combination. A national restaurant chain. And each has a unique perspective on the future of protein. And I would say protein that doesn't sacrifice human health or the environment, or importantly, access to protein, which becomes more troublesome as protein consumption increases. So, well, I'll just kick it off by just asking questions of the panelists, and I invite you all to chime in as you see fit, so we can get a discussion going. But I'll start off with Dan Kish, who's the Senior Vice President of Panera. You guys are a mass market restaurant company, and I'm curious how you think about protein, or how you try and move the dial on protein, or do you simply just follow your consumers?
Thank you. I would say that, boy, we've got a track record of about 10 years of not following the consumer.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is, boy, I recall the conversations 10, 11 years ago where we were making the decision to move to raise without antibiotic poultry, or poultry raised without antibiotics, never ever. And that was not something that was done sort of at scale. And at the time, scale was like 600 restaurants. And now we're just crossed the 2,000 cafe line. So I'd start by saying that we're unable to follow the consumer because oftentimes the consumer isn't able to articulate what they want. But when we've offered things like better proteins in a responsible portion size, they kept coming back. And we watch and analyze everything, as you might imagine, and we want to keep doing the things that are working for the customer. So what we found is a couple of things. One is they want quality over quantity, at least our customer, this rings true. And the other thing is they want options and optionality. So there was a time not all that long ago when just about everything had animal protein on it, on the menu. And we'd be happy to take it off for you. Well, that didn't sound like a good business strategy. Why don't we have some things for people who don't want animal protein? And don't just substitute, the lack of animal protein, but rather supplementing with legumes and nuts and other raw vegetables that can really sustain someone through the course of their day and yet still be craveable and make them want to come back for more. So I would say, in summary, we've not followed, but rather tried to lead, and we lead best by giving the options that people want.
And so has your protein overall protein, or actually, it's probably protein per customer or that you sell, has that gone down over the, are people choosing less protein options or alternative proteins, vegetable proteins?
I would say that yes, when we introduced quinoa and other ancient grains, simply cooked. This is so little science in this and just so much basic good cooking. We found they were very apt to try and continue to try. What we find that works best is when we have, because the majority of our customers are animal protein enjoyers, if you will, not non-vegan, non-vegetarian. But there are a lot of your average folk out there who are opting not to eat meat when they're given the compelling choice not to. So we found that it's better to, I mean, I would say, I'm not sure that our protein consumption has gone down all that much, but the options to not have animal protein or mix proteins, plant-based and animal, are much more prevalent than they were in the past.
Okay, great. So, Greg, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your business, which is really imagines an alternative protein, and sort of, I'm not going to give it away, you could talk about it, and where you know, how you got this idea and where it's kind of gone in the brief time you're
Sure.
Yeah.
So we actually agree with you that consumers don't quite know what they want, or even actively might want something that they currently think they really could not stand. And we at EXO are developing food products made from crickets. Really any bugs are on the table eventually, but we found that crickets are the easiest sell. And the idea kind of came about when the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization put out this really large report a couple years ago all about edible insect consumption around the world. And as it turns out, there are over 1,900 species of insects that are consumed in one way or another, and actually more people eat bugs on a daily basis than speak English. So all over Southeast Asia, Latin America, Africa, you really find it all the time, and it's very common. Completely wide array of preparations and types of insects, and pricing. In some countries, they're actually delicacies that cost more than beef, chicken, pork. Other countries, they're not. They're cheaper. And you know, I read this report. I was living with a friend at the time at university, and we were blown away by this idea that there's this entirely new food group that we in the West really have no interaction with at all. And it turns out that insects are incredibly sustainable to raise. Their feed conversion ratio, which is how much input they need to create edible protein as an output, is almost 1.1 to 1, and that's compared to about 10 to 1 for 10 to 1 for cows. And so they produce 80 times less methane. They obviously need far less land and water to raise. You can raise them indoors in urban areas. And it just kind of felt like there was nobody trying to overcome what are obviously some large hurdles here in the US at least, around convincing consumers and educating consumers as to the benefits of this food group. And like you were mentioning before, even you see in these developing countries a much larger demand for protein and meat. And so there really is an opportunity to try and position insects as a totally sustainable and reasonable protein option all around the world.
Okay, so it sounds reasonable. How many people in the audience have eaten crickets? Wow,
Well,
this is a cricket-eating
that's a
audience.
lot. I've never seen that many hands before.
I don't know if the video caught it, but way more than half of the hands in here went up, which is kind of amazing.
Yeah, and I mean, a few years ago, you never would have seen that, right? I mean, there's been so much attention in the media paid to this industry. There's now about 20 different food companies using crickets in one form or another on the market, in products ranging from protein bars, which we make, to chips, to cookies. And it's sort of become this whole cottage industry now. There are cricket farms all over the country and all over the world that raise crickets specifically for these companies using organic feed and filtered water. And it's interesting to see an industry at this time because in a lot of ways there's so much promise and potential in terms of how sustainable it could be. But obviously you have to be concerned because just because the statistics say that insects could avoid a lot of the resource intensity of cows or chickens or pigs, obviously if the industry sort of grows up in a way that mimics industrial livestock as we see it today, that really won't end up being that much more sustainable. So it's interesting to try and apply those learnings to something that's really at a crossroads.
Right. And so how do you sell crickets? I mean, do you put crickets on your package, and or do you, what's the marketing magic here?
So we don't want to trick anybody ever into eating something they don't want to eat, but at the same time there is an irrationality around a disgust reflex that people have where they see a picture of an insect and it sort of activates this thing. It reminds them of a spider or a termite or something slimy, and it's not appetizing. So we don't actually feature any pictures of any insects anywhere on our packaging or our website. But we do a lot of education around it.
And you said it's a flour product, right?
Yeah, so it's basically...
It's not like you're not putting the cricket in.
No, it's crickets that are dehydrated and milled into a fine flour, so it would look like any ingredient you could find in a baking section of a supermarket. It's got an extremely neutral taste. You would never be able to pick out a cricket product from a non-cricket product if you didn't know the difference. And so, again, there's really no reason whatsoever to not eat bugs. It's purely psychological. And that's why we follow the food waste conversation and the imperfect produce conversations very closely, because we're all dealing with the same issue of trying to convince people to do something that they, for whatever reason, feel it makes them eat a worse product, when really it's equally as nutritious, equally as sustainable, and cheaper, obviously.
So Dan, are we going to see a cricket bagel at Panera?
It's not in the works currently. Let's just put it that way.
Did the light bulb go off? Or
I'm thinking about it.
We've got a room full of consumers here, so.
Clearly.
And there's a Panera right down the street. Right?
All right.
So, okay. But now we're going to move back to meat with Michael, who is selling red meat, which we're all told to now avoid or reduce. So what's your pitch to us, or what are you doing with red meat that's maybe different?
So I'm one of the founding partners, and I run the supply chain at Elevation Burger. We're a 60 restaurant fast casual chain. We pale in size compared to Panera, who's doing some amazing things in the fast casual space. We've taken an all organic approach to our proteins. So we decided early on when developing the business model in 2005 that hamburgers and French fries are an American way of life. It goes hand in hand with July 4th and summer grilling, and it's something that I don't know that we're going to escape as a society. And so we decided to disrupt that, or at least play a better role in providing this kind of food to the American consumer. In 2005, when we started Elevation Burger, it was a fairly novel idea, organic grass-fed beef. And it was something that you could really only access in a specialty shop, at a Whole Foods, perhaps at your farmer's market. And we felt that was not, we didn't like that. We liked the idea of bringing more organic meat to the masses. And so our business model from day one has been to source and supply our consumers with only organic grass-fed beef. And there are a lot of redeeming qualities for organic grass-fed beef that kind of don't fall inside of the conversation around conventional cattle. All of our cattle are raised on pasture. Our cattle, per the National Organic Program, are not allowed to receive any antibiotics ever. If they're given antibiotics when sick, they must be isolated and ultimately removed from the organic supply. They are free roaming on pasture. There's been much to do about the methane output of cattle operations, and grass-fed animals are walking around on much larger spaces. It is not producing concentrated amounts of methane that is being set into the atmosphere in one small feedlot area. There's also not the risk of water runoff from the contaminants that are in the manure, which is where some of the antibiotic-resistant bacteria in society right now is coming from, is from these waste lagoons or runoffs from the farms. It's also a much more humane treatment of the animal from birth even through to slaughter. It also has additional health benefits, nutritional benefits to the consumer. It has higher levels of omega-3 fatty acids as compared to omega-6 fatty acids, and a better balance of that. You hear about that frequently in salmon. It's not quite as high as salmon is, but it is a much better ratio than what you'd find in conventional meat.
So a couple of questions. Are people coming to you for a burger, or are they coming to you for all the reasons you just said?
So it's a good question, and Greg kind of hit it on the head, and I think we've been circling around it for a lot of the panels and discussion today. The consumers have a really difficult time understanding what some of the food labeling means out there, particularly organic. Organic encompasses a tremendous amount of very specific things you should and should not do to your product as you're raising it to be able to sell it as organic. There's a veil of some opacity, opaqueness to what organic is. And so I think the consumer has a hard time at this point really understanding the roll downs of organic. And in a restaurant environment, I think Dan could probably speak to this, you don't have a lot of time to preach to the consumer. It's not like being at a grocery store. You walk into a Whole Foods meat counter and you can read all the attributes. You can read about the farms. You can hear about their GAP certifications. We don't get that much time with the consumer in the fast casual market. And additionally, Greg touched on this, the consumer doesn't necessarily want to connect a living animal with what they're about to eat. There's some separation in the retail stores that you can get away with doing that, but a lot of our market research, and I've heard others in the industry say the same, is you're not going to just slap pictures of animals up there. So it's hard to reveal all that is behind what it is we're doing to the consumer without sounding too preachy, without losing their interest, without, frankly, confusing them more. So as disheartening as it is sometimes to see, our market research actually says probably about a third of our consumers are choosing us based on solely the quality of the meat. We're then also a fast casual restaurant. We have competitors that are in the conventional space, Five Guys, Smash Burger, any hamburger joint, and so a lot of it's about convenience. About a third to 50% of our guests were the most convenient burger shop. I think the taste is also primo. The quality of the ingredients that we're sourcing leads to a better tasting product, so we get very high marks with satisfaction for consumers when they eat our food. But yeah, it's probably about a third.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on, we have Shen, who's the venture capitalist democracy activist, and I love that. It's kind of
same content.
Yeah, maybe they can be the same. I don't know. But you're investing in the food space. You're active in it. How do these issues about future of protein, all of these alternatives that these guys are talking about, how do you look at that from a business point of view, or where this market is going?
Yeah, actually, so I founded, I've been a lifelong activist, building movement, social movement, cultural movement, now movement with key business aspects to it throughout my entire adult life. I started as a student activist back in China, in Tiananmen, and if you're under 30, obviously I'm dating myself, so you don't know, and that's okay. So fast forward to now. What we do, I'm a coach and a mentor to earlier stage solutions, and specifically in the form of business accelerator that takes early stage company in an intensive training period, and then we invest in them and launch them and invest them in multiple rounds, as a venture capital what we call it, and for this is a fairly long-term relationship, 5 to 10 year relationship, multi-stage. We're patient. We would like to think patient and smart capital. And personally, I still eat meat, so I still live with the omnivore's dilemma. But to Sam's question, we actually, is that me? It's how do I look at protein? We actually don't. But what I mean is that in our core thesis, the whole deductionist monolithic approach to food that seems to be normal. I mean, that's really a new normal. It's actually an anomaly. We think about a particular element. I mean, fat used to be the evil, right? Now sugar is the new evil, right? And then we look at things, I mean, from industrial perspective, that this kind of a framing, this kind of thinking produced monolithic culture in poultry. It must be me. I'm the only China dude in the room. So it's same breed. I mean, often genetically engineered, right? And this is before birth, right? So and then from a consumer perspective, think about there's a silver bullet, there's a magic ingredient. If you eat more or you eat less, then things will just fundamentally change. It just doesn't happen that way. Why is that? That's the part we understand, the part we don't, and we kind of need to go along with. That's how nature works, right? I mean, I'm on the board partially because I like the taste, partly because I kind of fully use my teeth, right? And we're built as omnivore, and I'm not advanced enough yet to be a vegan or a vegetarian. I say that without any irony. I think that's an enlightened state. I'm probably migrating toward. So I want to tell a personal story how I grew up in China. And this is the 1970s and early 80s. Right? So my family of 5, we have Roshan. This is for 1 month. We have about 5 that will be 6 kilos of meat for a family of 5 for whole month, right? So fortunately, there was all good protein. That's the next level I want to get to. It's not protein as element, but if we look at protein, it's not protein per se. It's whether it's protein in terms of calorie and volume that fall off nutrients or empty ones or even poisonous ones, right? So that makes a very, very big difference, right? So, but we need to chop it up in very small pieces. We need to really cook it well and make it flavorful, right? So that there's enough satisfaction, the little meat that we have. So when I had the first American burger, that was such a treat, That was like, for my generation, that people still thought, there's still a lingering memory of fast food is a luxury, right?
So was a burger the equivalent of what your whole family would eat for meat in one meal?
Well, more actually.
It's
we
more.
Put it down for 30 days. If we don't eat it every day, we couldn't have. So we're borderline, and this is the capital. I grew up in Beijing, right? Think of the capital as in Hunger Game, right? So this we're best supplied city in China before the last 25, 30 years, right? Fast forward, as our keynote has pointed out, right? Today, China, and this is not exclusive to China. You think of any country outside the Western industrial world, right? Barely moving out of poverty. What's the first thing they do? They go buy Coca-Cola and McDonald's burger, right? So this is a peculiar version of what seems to be known as Western diet, which really give a bad name to the kind of stuff Michael is doing here. I mean, it's a good American burger is just fantastic, right? It's really good on all accounts. And if time allows, we'll get to that. Environmentally, health-wise, taste, culture, all of it, right? But this particular version that is highly processed food in general, but in fast food restaurant chains that's really high in calorie and low in nutrient or even negligible nutrients. So that's why it's not. I mean, so in the industrial West, starting with North America, starting with U.S., right? We have this paradoxical phenomenon that the face of hunger in America is actually obesity, right? Again, nature is at work here because our guts simply doesn't agree with this really seemingly efficient process of very high calorie. I mean, it's not lack of discipline. People are eating a lot more. It's lack of nutrients in those proteins, in those calories, right? So our guts don't evolve as much. It's not as easily compared to the mic, and compared to our taste bud or brain, right? So that's why you have this vicious cycle. Think about dietary programs and weight loss programs, right? After 30, 40 years, why Americans are growing literally sideways, right? This is not just a lack of discipline. It's because the food we're eating just is not satisfying and nutritious enough. That's why we're eating third as much as we need for adult Americans, right? That's why last year or the year before, is the first time not only obesity among American adults passed 70%, but obesity and overweight. But for the first time within that 70%, right, obesity surpassed overweight. So this is epidemic. This is a large-scale epidemic. And globally, the larger problem than hunger and lack of water is actually this, meaning that any country start to have economic development, they move to this particular version of what's called Western diet, right? Highly processed. So, I'm using up all my time, but at Food Future, which is our fund, impact investment fund, and business accelerator, we tend to look at taste, actually, because food first and foremost should be enjoyment, not a punishment, right? So it's not different from building a social movement where you protest and try to change policy or even regime change. Different from cultural movement where you preach and educate, right? Business meets where consumers are. So we basically incentivize. I look at concepts where you incentivize taste, so people eat more in a more satisfied way, so they will naturally eat less because they're eating the right food, because nature will be at work, right? So it's more a positive feedback loop instead of feeling ashamed of I really need to eat less and I'm eating too much a day. And then if I eat actual hot burger, I go to gym for and then so it's this vicious cycle that we're trying to break, and we believe we can, because not only the macroeconomics is there, because again, building a business-related movement, you want to meet people where they want to be, right? So we look at not only what the future is predicting and what macroeconomics and sustainability require us as mankind needs to do, humankind needs to do, but also, more importantly, look at the groundswell of entrepreneurial energy. And that's where I see the very hopeful future, because there's no lack of solution of whether it's alternative protein or think of an entire Buddhist cuisine, right? I mean, turning a plant-based protein into everything in form, in shape, in aroma, in taste, right? So there's no lack of solution. In the last 2 years or so, I've looked at about 2,000 businesses. We have a very low emission rate. We take about 10 companies every 6 months. So we got to see the trend lines from where the entrepreneurial energy comes from all over the world. So there's a lot of solutions. If time allows, we can get into some of those.
Yeah, great. Okay, so let's move on to Leslie, and after we had sort of the male carnivore part of the panel, we get vegan activist, female, and I don't know if we can include crickets in there, but okay. But anyway, Leslie, why don't you talk a little bit about what you do? Obviously reducing meat consumption. If we're talking about that as a sustainable value, obviously veganism is part of that. I think one of the problems is maybe convincing people to actually do that, take that path. And I'm wondering, first, if you could talk about what you do with the VegFund, and then, maybe get into some of these issues.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. VegFund is supporting vegan activism and vegan outreach globally. And it's an organization that has now turned the corner on supporting activists for about 7 years now. And so I think Michael made a very important observation that people just don't want to see the face of that animal that they're about to eat, or that maybe they're already eating. There's a cognitive dissonance in the food system. Again, we love our cats and dogs, but for whatever reason, our farmed animals have been, at least in the United States, predominantly now sequestered away in centralized feeding operation systems, and we just don't, for the most part, know what is going on there. And in these past couple of years, there's been the upshot of the gag laws, in which if an investigative journalist is trying to film the production of animal agriculture and or the slaughter, it's a really serious penalty. I mean, you can be put away, you can be imprisoned for a long time as the one who's exploring that process. So it's so fascinating in this country, in which we've heard many speakers today, say that we are, over-proteined by a factor of approximately 2 to 1. That we cannot feed a growing planet with animal agriculture, that we have rising health concerns, that we have environmental degradation, that is associated with animal agriculture, yet there remains this very sticky, I think, cognitive dissonance about eating animals. And so we are, with VegFund, trying to educate the general population about the opportunities in plant-based eating, that in fact you can get the proteins, the amino acids, the micronutrients that you need from plants, and that you don't need to eat animals to be a healthy person. And I think it's really fascinating when I was talking to my partner who does humanitarian aid and has been involved in scores of feeding operations for people who are dying from malnutrition. The last thing they race in with would be animal protein. I mean, those folks are fed iodized salt, they're fed oils, grains, soy, and so I think we have this perception that we can't survive without animal proteins, but in fact we can.
And in terms of getting, convincing people, I take it that you're taking sort of a positive message. There is an alternative, and I mean, do you perceive a change?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's just incredibly phenomenal. Shen and I, if I were Chinese, we probably would have been at Tiananmen together. So I'm of a certain age in which, in my youth, a vegan was seriously someone who was out there eating lettuce every day. And, no one really understood that diet, particularly in rural Ohio where I grew up. At any rate now, come fast forward in one generation, excuse me, I now have 2 vegan nieces and I see vegan food options in many restaurants. Absolutely excellent options today in the consumer marketplace. And I think we're hearing on this panel that consumers are finally coming forward to, excuse me, request more plant-based options.
Okay. Okay, and I'm just going to open this up to the panel, but, many of you are in business, either pursuing or looking for alternatives. In terms of scale, you're relatively small. And I guess my question is related to what I was just talking to Leslie. What is going to bring things forward? Is it going to be business, or is it going to be something else that catalyzes some sort of change? Or do we end up with the figures we had, that meat consumption is going to increase by 80% by 2050? I mean, what's going to shift that?
It needs the ecosystem, right? I mean, this kind of is a little bit more on business, but policy. I would think, I would see kind of four engines. I mean, you need do you need a 4 engine to move this movement forward? Probably not, but you move at full speed if it does. When it's policy, and especially in the U.S., actually in a lot of countries, you can make immediate change. But I mean, right now, at least for future, we're trying to be good at one thing, not terrible on 4. So we're not focused on policy, but that can make huge immediate change. I mean, the dietary recommendations, the government subsidies, and especially the latter is a big part of the problem. Obviously, that's one of the reasons we end up here, right? And then there's, I think, one area that's very, like this very conference, that's actually really leading the way is a cultural, educational aspect. That's where the groundswell of consumer behavior change, right? I mean, storytellers, investor journalists, celebrity chefs, right? I mean, the China story I was telling you about, growing up in China, that's now has a name in this country called the third plate, right? I mean, eat less, a smaller portion, not center of the plate. Right, so I mean, I think that's really been leading the way. Where I mean, from what I can tell, we're really riding on that wave of this cultural advocacy, behavioral change.
Right, but I mean, China had that history, but it's going in the other direction, right?
I mean, I would say that actually, I think the thing that's working in all of our favors the most is something that's out of our control, and that's just sort of the environmental factors that are just going to continue to force us to find new ways to diversify our systems, because it's really bad to have all your eggs in one basket when avian flu hits. And then there's...
Literally, yeah.
Yeah. And then, and you saw with Hampton Creek, which is an eggless mayo, when the avian flu crisis hit last year, the year before, their sales shot up, not really because of anything that they did or planned for, but just because nature intervened and it, just revealed the system to be as unstable as we all know it is. So I think that's going to just keep happening. Climate change is going to play a big factor, and it's going to push people, whether they like it or not, really into some of these more sustainable solutions.
Right.
I think Shen hit on the two things that I think are the most major, and it's consumer awareness and demand, and it's policy. and there's growing, mounting research that's very compelling to change a lot of the industrial agriculture ways that we've kind of set into over the last 50 or 60 years. The challenge with the policy side of that is it's been around for 50 or 60 years, and you have a tremendous amount of infrastructure, you have a tremendous amount of money, associations, businesses, there's a long line of places that policy changes impact. And I live here in Washington, D.C., and I understand how a lot of the policy works, and I don't want to give policy a pass, but that is a really hard ship to move. There's certain opportunities that you get. Someone asked earlier about the Farm Bill and sidestepping it, and I don't think you sidestep the Farm Bill, but it's going to be a slow creep. We got to where we are over 50 or 60 years, and I think from a policy perspective, it may take equally long to kind of dig ourselves out of that. Hopefully not. But and then that's where it leads to kind of the consumer piece. If the consumer awareness and the drive continues to go in that direction, and the mounting research becomes something that groups are bringing to the government and demanding change, and you have businesses like Panera that on a very large scale are working to eradicate subtherapeutic antibiotic use in livestock, you're making significant change that ultimately will put pressure on the government to have to change the policy. So to me, those are the two big things, and it's hard to say where do you drive. You need to drive at both. But expecting government to change overnight because of mounting research, it's a bit harsh. They don't do that in other areas, besides food. Look at how long it's taken us to get around to climate change and environment and that piece of it. So I think the hardest work and the work that we can control is how the consumers drive things. And if we take money away from the businesses that are not doing things the right way, then we're going to drive change across business and we're going to drive change across government.
Yeah, and on that point, I just want to give a plug to Fern, because we had a story this week that took a deep dive into how the dietary guidelines were written and sort of the pushback from industry to some of the changes that were attempting to be made in those guidelines. So I encourage you all to look at that at thefern.org.
Just to finish that list, I was mentioning policy. We're all copying on policy and cultural shift. There is, when generally, in politics and in governance, if democratic process doesn't work, direct democracy steps in. In this case, the consumer behavior and kind of the social movement converge. Hopefully, right? We've seen some early successes, such as the potato workers' protest, right? And fast food restaurant chain workers protest, and that produce positive result, right? And then the last piece, of course, that's my home court, which is you're building really successful, scalable, accessible, large consumer businesses, and is another even philosophically effective way to fight a existing malfunctioning system. The best way to fight it, to fight any system, is to make it obsolete, right? So when you have a good burger versus bad ones, even though it seems like more pricey, but because of satisfaction and nutrition, after a while you actually eat less. That's by the way, that's how I convince a IT founder type of partnership in VC. I basically show them, look, there's no way I can redo this whole nutritional medical research on it, but there's one number macroeconomically I can point to, right? If people eat 1/3 of what they are willing to, because of satisfaction of the right kind of food, right? And then even if they're paying twice the price, right? You come out ahead in terms of money saved, right? So that's the macroeconomic aspect. That's the business engine, right? Hopefully that will drive the movement.
Yeah, Dan, you wanted to jump in here?
Yeah, I love that the customer keeps coming up, and what people want is a resounding theme here. And I think the term policy can also apply to us as people and us as businesses. So businesses who take risks and who create policies for themselves that create change make a big difference. So, maybe Panera seems big relative to Elevation today. Relative to the rest of the eating public, we're tiny. But I can tell you that 10 years ago, there was not enough supply for our sort of requests and our goals and aspirations to do the things we were doing. So we had to create a marketplace. And when that marketplace shifts, other people get on board. And when it's working for one person, and there's a bit of a domino effect that takes place. And it does take place over years, decades, whatever. But knowing that, people are taking better personal accountability for themselves, their whole lifestyle. Food isn't going to fix it for them. There's no, silver bullet. How they live, what they do and don't do, it all comes back to our own personal policies. And then working with people who are like-minded and companies who are trying to make a difference. I just think what we put upon ourselves will make the biggest difference versus waiting for others to do it.
Right. And so what's the story, what is the motivation between Panera, phasing out antibiotics in their meat supply?
Well, it began as it didn't have anything to do with antibiotics, actually. It was, our chicken's not very good. What's wrong with it? And we looked at the marketplace and said, well, who's got the best chicken? It turned out... You
didn't think it tasted very good? Was that the issue?
No, it didn't. It didn't taste as good as chicken. It didn't taste like chicken. Quite frankly, tomatoes don't taste like tomatoes. Chicken didn't taste like chicken. And there were so many things that were covered up through the manufacturing of food process that it was like, well, what if we just step back? And the systems didn't exist. There were cooking methods that had been around, but not employed at scale. So when I can say, if you eat the roasted turkey, it's raised without antibiotics, turkey, vegetarian fed, never ever, salt and pepper, and cooking methods. That's it. Now, it's at great scale, and certainly at great cost. So what we found is we had to invest in figuring how to do things, getting it in front of customers who appreciated it, because if they weren't buying it, I'm not sure we would be doing it, quite honestly. But the fact is, clean flavor, good food, clean food sells, and it led us to the next step and the next step. So our move to grass-fed beef was a very unsung move. We didn't do it because necessarily it was grass-fed. That was a nice to have, but it tasted so much better than what we had been engaged with. So I think flavor, we're pretty base as human beings. If we eat something and we don't like it, we don't eat it again. And if it's not convenient, we don't do it more. So you have to find the right things for the right people at the right times that solve problems in their lives. And if you're trying to live a better, healthier life, and you got to do it in a convenient way, we happen to benefit by that, by the relationship we have with that customer.
Right. So we have a few minutes left, and we're going to go to Q&A. And I see a hand up in the back. Any others? I'll just go. Okay, one and then two. So. And I'd encourage you all to, ask questions. If you have comments or statements, feel free to come up to the panelists afterwards, and discuss. But if we could keep it to questions, that'd be great. Oh, sorry.
Quick question. It's just remarkable to see that in a forum discussing proteins, we automatically tend to move towards meat and almost hijack the terminology without making sort of actively done it too. Even in the myplate.gov, the new piece, it has three, and really this is a quasi question and a comment. There is vegetables, there is fruits, there is grains, there is dairy, and the bottom right quadrant says protein. But if you look at it, vegetable, fruits, grains, and dairy are all foods. Protein is a chemical, it's an amino acid. And if I took the dietary guideline, I'll have protein toxicity because it has 25% of the quadrant is protein, assuming vegetables don't have protein. There are enough vegetables that have more protein than beef. Assumes dairy doesn't have protein, that has more protein. Nuts don't have proteins, but they do have protein. So if I followed the dietary guidelines, I would probably die of protein toxicity. Anybody on the panel has a view?
That was my first answer, right? How do we look at protein? We don't. We don't look at protein. We look at holistically, right? That's how you relate to nature as human being through food.
Yeah. I mean, I think this gets into the politicization of the dietary guidelines process, you know, and especially the lobbying in the meat industry, which was quite strong, especially when there were recommendations to reduce meat consumption. I mean, and that's the power of the status quo, really, which is quite, you know, quite powerful. So anybody else want to react, or no? We're good. Okay, I think we go ahead.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the panel for a great conversation. I know, Leslie, you were talking about how more and more people are becoming vegan, like Bill Clinton and Al Gore, who are great examples. I know we have a gender-segregated vegan and non-vegan panel here, but there are a lot of men too. But what seems more interesting than the people who are becoming vegan is just the people who are reducing meat consumption, that Americans are now eating 10% less meat today than we were just about 8 years ago on a per person basis. And even if people aren't becoming vegans, as a nation, we're eating more plants and fewer animals. And so my question is really for our friend at Panera. You all have done some cool things, adding plant-based options. I know you had the soba noodle soup. I don't know if that's still on the menu, but you'd mentioned you're looking at doing other plant-based options. I'm wondering what we might be able to expect from Panera for people who, whether they're reducing their meat consumption or they don't want to ever eat meat. What should we be looking for at Panera?
So I can tell you that it's unlikely that anytime soon we're going to move into meat analogs, meaning vegetables disguised as meat. I think there's plenty of great sources for protein, to this gentleman's point, that have nothing to do with animal protein. And my body doesn't really think about it when it gets in there. You know, it processes. It does what it's built to do. So as long as the inputs are right. So you're going to see more legumes. You're going to see more nuts. And I don't mean nuts coated in spices and sugars and all sorts of added things. I mean just roasted almonds, toasted walnuts. If you can eat nuts, eat them. If you can't, we'll work around that. But I think it's the simple sources of food left, you know, the things you would have at home should be the things you could find out in the convenience marketplace that are put together in ways that, again, solve the problem you have, whether it's breakfast, lunch, dinner, or those times in between, all those other meals we have a tendency to eat. Being satisfied is probably the biggest trick. I heard earlier today the term nutrient density. I love that that's becoming more of a theme, that a calorie is not a calorie. And we were one of the first, if not the first, to put calories on our menu because we saw the trend or the guidelines or whatever the law was coming. But you know, in the end, those are just numbers. My body doesn't think in numbers, it thinks in nutrients. So what makes up those calories, and we'll be bringing forth more of the right things to eat and toning down the things that are maybe more processed or more refined. And we're not perfect. I mean, we're a bakery cafe. You can get a cinnamon roll too. So it does come down to personal choice.
Yeah. And I would add, wheat is the #1 source of protein in the world. 20% of the world's calories.
Just eat good bread.
Yeah, good bread.
Eat good bread.
Whole grain bread. Yeah. Yes, over here.
Hi, I have a comment that I hope maybe you'll respond to. So I'm from the Western United States and I work with a lot of ranchers, and where I'm from, I see beef production as really important because it's a really critical tool for carbon sequestration in our soil, for building really healthy landscapes. And beef is, you know, it's a place-based protein that we produce in the West, and that I guess my question is about, microphone still on, the idea of place-based protein and its appropriateness, because a lot of the things that you're talking about, it's sort of like they come from all over the world, but specifically in terms of climate change, I think place-based proteins are important.
Yeah. Michael, do you want to talk about that? Because you were talking about sourcing beef and the issues with grass-fed beef.
So I can't speak to exactly the community you live in, but I think the challenge is less, you know, I know beef, I know chicken, I know pork, that's what we do. We do we do 2 different veggie burgers, but you know, the bulk of what we do is in beef. Beef consumption is going down in the United States as compared to chicken, but it's not going away. So I certainly wouldn't be an advocate for abandoning the ranches in the Midwest that are producing meat. I think that it's the way in which it's being produced that's the challenge. It's not the beef itself. We've kind of bastardized the cow, and it's really the process. It's the industrial agriculture that's come up around how that cow is produced. It's the scale that it's produced at. It's the corn and the soy feed that it's getting and the monocropping that it is requiring to satisfy that need. So it's not the ranch, it's not the cow, it's kind of everything else that's around it that really needs tweaking and fixing to help the food system move forward and kind of return to harmony as we were with cattle farming, prior to probably 1950.
Yeah, and I would add, that the industrial meat system hasn't particularly made it easier for farmers, for cattle ranchers, right? It's a really tough business.
It's a big one to unravel. There's a lot of special interest behind changing how we farm cattle. Kind of going back to what I'd said about policy and business and association and that push that's there on the other side. There's a large group of organizations and businesses that are directly tied to how it is we're creating our beef in this country right now, and unraveling that by consumer demand driving it with the policy side of it is really it needs to unravel because it's problematic.
Yeah, I don't know that there's a one-to-one relationship between the sequestration of the carbon and the carbon dioxide that the beef are producing. And I also think that beef is quite damaging to biodiversity. We see a lot of aerial gunning of wolves and other coyotes and other canids in this country that I believe are related to ranching. And so we're not factoring in what are the effects of the loss of that biodiversity. Sorry, my allergies are really kicking up. Apologies.
Yeah. Okay, one up here. Yeah.
First, I wanted to thank you all for coming. We really appreciate you being panelists, and I'm really honored to speak with you today. And I'm going to stay on the topic of protein. Certain scientific studies show that animal-based protein actually cause diseases such as cardiovascular diseases, they cause cancer, and actually milk from cows can cause osteoporosis. So when you're talking to your consumers and when you're talking to the public about protein, how do you manage the struggles that come with scientific research that shows that actually plant-based protein is the best for your diet and for your health? And I just wanted to also reiterate that although America as the United States as a country might be decreasing in their animal consumption, 80% of an increase in animal consumption in the world is going to happen compared to a 20% increase in energy. And so we talk a lot about how energy's been increasing, but actually in the world now that China's going through huge development and India's going through huge development, this is becoming a global problem. So how do you address these health issues with protein in animal-based products?
Hi, everyone. Just a quick reminder to keep the questions to 30 seconds and have actual questions. Great comment, great information, but let's get to the questions and get to the panelists' answers.
Okay, and you guys want to address that? How do you address health on your, I guess it would be for the business guys, like, do you make a health pitch?
It seems it's a common sense. It's one of very cordial panel. We all agree with each other. I guess it's not a mic day for me. It's raised good cattle that eat good meat. That's it. Meat is not going away. With all the study, that would be the answer. The problem of whether environmental pollution, energy, as far as I can see, all of that come from industrial agriculture. It's a factory farm. It's not the traditional way of raising cattle. It's not a traditional way of raising poultry, or for that matter, all animal-centric protein. I'm not aware of that particular medical study, but if you put it simply, just eat the food is supposed to look like in nature and raise them that way, and eat it with a culinary approach. People think, oh, you're impact investor, so you don't believe in engineering. I said, no, I absolutely believe in engineering. I'm modern day trained biologist. I love cooking. And that's a heavy engineering. It's called cooking.
Anybody else want to tackle that or help? Or you guys?
I would only say that we should all just give people more compelling reasons to go without animal protein, and people will go there. I hate to oversimplify it, but make it available and you'll be surprised what happens.
So lead with the food.
Yes.
Yeah, and also
flavor.
A calorie is not a calorie. Not all animal protein is created equal either. So I think it's important to segregate maybe industrial animal production from, small ranch grass-fed beef.
Okay. I think we're it. We're time's up. But thank you. Oh, do we have time for one more? Okay, oh no, we got to wrap. We got to go. Okay, sorry. Why don't you come up afterwards and you could address, panel.
I couldn't make it up here quick enough. Thank you to our panel.